July 6, 1973. Corona del Mar, California. A Friday afternoon in the middle of summer. 11-year-old Linda O'Keefe walked out of Lincoln Intermediate School at the end of the day and sat down on the curb in front of the building. She had been crying. A few minutes earlier, she had called her mother from the school office and asked for a ride home. She did not have her bike that day. She had gotten a ride to school from her piano teacher that morning, which meant that the walk back, a walk she knew, through a neighborhood she had grown up in, was the only option left. Her mother, Cindy, was busy with work and told her she would have to walk. Linda hung up the phone and went outside. She sat on that curb for a few minutes. A classmate named Jandy saw her there. Jandy and her mother spotted Linda a little later, near the intersection of Marguerite and Inlet Drive, talking to a white man in a turquoise van. The van stopped next to her more than once. And then Linda O'Keefe was gone. Her parents did not hear from her that afternoon. When evening came and Linda had not returned home, they began calling. Then they began driving. Then they called the police. The search went through the night. On the morning of July 7, 1973, a local architect named Ron Yo was riding his bicycle along the Back Bay Nature Trail with his young son. He stopped to show his son a spot where frogs could usually be found. He found Linda instead. She was still wearing the dress her mother had made for her. She was still carrying the handmade book bag she had brought to school. She had been strangled. Her killer changed his name and left California. He was not identified for 4 to 6 years. Before we go into this story, let us know where you are watching from. And if you want more cases like this, subscribe, because how investigators finally found the man in that turquoise van almost half a century later is one of the most remarkable things forensic science has produced in the last decade. To understand what happened to Linda O'Keefe, you need to understand what the summer of 1973 looked like in Corona del Mar. Corona del Mar sits on the Pacific coast in Orange County, California, at the southern edge of Newport Beach. In 1973, it was a small, sun-drenched beach community, the kind of place where children moved between houses freely, where parents sent their kids to school without a second thought, and where the danger that existed in the larger world felt genuinely distant. The streets were familiar. The neighbors were familiar. A child walking home from school in Corona del Mar in the summer of 1973 was, by every reasonable measure of the era, in a safe place. Linda and O'Keefe was 11 years old. She was the middle child in a family of 5, with an older sister named Cindy, a younger sister, and parents who by every account created the kind of home where children felt both loved and free. Her father Richard, a machinist, shared a particularly close bond with her. She rode her bike to school most days. She played piano. She was, by the description of everyone who knew her, a cheerful, ordinary 11-year-old girl in the middle of an ordinary summer. The detail that July 6, 1973 turned on, the detail that changed everything, was a bicycle. Normally, Linda rode her bike to summer school. But on that Friday, she had gotten a ride from her piano teacher. And without her bike, when school ended, she had no way home except her feet. She went to the school office and called her mother. Cindy O'Keefe, busy with work, told her daughter to walk. She said she was too busy to come. She told Linda it was not a long walk. It was not a long walk. But it was the wrong walk on the wrong day. Linda left the school upset and crying. A classmate, Jandy, saw her sitting on the curb outside the building. Within the hour, Jandy and her mother spotted Linda on her route home, near the intersection of Marguerite and Inlet Drive, in conversation with a man standing beside a turquoise or blue-green van. The man appeared to be white, approximately 25 years old. The van stopped near Linda more than once. Jandy and her mother watched. They did not intervene. There was no obvious reason to intervene, no visible sign of distress in that moment, nothing that separated the scene from any number of ordinary interactions between a child and an adult on a summer afternoon. They drove on. Linda O'Keefe was never seen alive again. The investigation that followed was immediate and extensive by the standards available in 1973. Police searched the area. They searched through the night and into the following morning. When Ron Yo found Linda's body in the Back Bay ditch on July 7, the Orange County Coroner's Office conducted an autopsy and determined she had been sexually assaulted and strangled. Her death was ruled a homicide. Investigators interviewed hundreds of people across the community. Witnesses who had seen the Turquoise van provided descriptions. Composite sketches were created. The van was never found. The man was never identified. The investigation reached in every direction available to it in 1973 and came back empty. The sleepy beach community of Corona del Mar was changed by Linda's murder in the particular way that a child's murder changes small communities, permanently, quietly, and without any of the formal acknowledgement that would have been visible from the outside. Children who had been Linda's classmates would carry her name with them for the rest of their lives. Her friend Terry Briscoe Corwin later recalled that she and her fellow 11-year-olds got on their bikes and rode around wanting to help find the killer. They were 11 years old. It was all they knew how to do. The investigation stalled. The case went cold. What did not go cold was the DNA. In the immediate aftermath of Linda's murder, investigators had collected biological evidence from her body. In 1973, forensic DNA technology did not exist. The science that would eventually make the evidence useful would not be developed for another decade. But the evidence was collected carefully and preserved, and when DNA technology became available in subsequent decades, investigators were able to develop a genetic profile of Linda's killer from the material that had been stored since 1973. That profile was entered into CODIS, the FBI's national criminal DNA database. It sat there for years. The database grew, case by case, conviction by conviction, and still the profile of Linda's killer returned no match. Whoever he was, he had never been caught for anything that would have put his DNA into the system. The case remained cold. But the Newport Beach Police Department, which had absorbed the original Corona del Mar jurisdiction over the years, did not let it die. Linda's photograph was kept in the detective division as a permanent reminder that her case was still open. Generations of investigators worked on it, each one inheriting the file from the last, each one adding what technology and effort could add, none of them finding the answer. In July of 2018, on the 45th anniversary of Linda's murder, detectives tried something that had never been done with this case before. Working with the Newport Beach Police Department's communications team, investigators created a social media campaign unlike anything law enforcement had attempted for a cold case of that age. They went to Twitter. And they told Linda's story in her own voice. For 24 hours on July 6 and 7, 2018, the Newport Beach Police Department posted a series of 68 tweets narrated from Linda's perspective. In real time, on the 45th anniversary of the actual events, Linda's voice described her morning, her piano teacher's car, the ride to school, the call from the school office, the conversation with her mother, the walk, the van, the man. The department posted photographs of her clothes. They posted the composite sketches from 1973. They shared the story with enough specificity and enough humanity that it was picked up and shared across the country and around the world. Police Sergeant Court Depweg and department spokeswoman Jen Manzella, who had designed the campaign together, said their goal was to give a little girl whose life was cut short at 11 years old the opportunity to speak again. They were also, implicitly, reaching toward her killer. The posts were designed to make him feel seen. To let him know that Linda's voice was still out in the world, describing what he had done. The Twitter campaign did not immediately produce the breakthrough. But it opened a door. Alongside the social media campaign, investigators had submitted the DNA evidence to Parabon NanoLabs, a Virginia-based genetics company specializing in a process called DNA phenotyping, the reconstruction of a physical profile from genetic material. Using the DNA from the 1973 evidence, Parabon produced composite images, what Linda's killer would have looked like at approximately 25 years old in 1973, and what he might look like today. Those images were released to the public. Still no name. But the pressure was building. Then investigators took the step that would finally close the distance between Linda's killer and the truth. They submitted the killer's DNA profile to a public genealogy database, the same technique that had just been used to identify the Golden State Killer in the same county. Forensic genealogy works not by searching for the killer himself, but by searching for his relatives. Anyone who shares enough of his DNA to be family. And families, in the age of ancestry websites, upload their genetic information voluntarily in enormous numbers, looking for their history. In January of 2019, the search returned a match. Not a direct match to the killer, but a genealogical connection, a family member whose DNA overlapped with the killer's profile in the way that blood relatives' DNA overlaps. Investigators began building the family tree from that connection, working the branches, narrowing the possibilities, until the lines converged on a name. James Alan Neal. 72 years old. Living quietly in Monument, Colorado. Neal had not always been James Alan Neal. He had been born James Albert Layton Jr., and he had grown up in the Los Angeles area, moving to Southern California from Chicago with his family. In 1973, he was 26 years old and working in construction. He had lived in the area where Linda was murdered. After Linda's body was found in the Back Bay ditch on July 7, 1973, James Layton moved to Florida. While in Florida, following an unspecified criminal incident, he changed his name to James Alan Neal. He moved again, eventually settling in Colorado, where he built a life that, from the outside, looked like any ordinary life. He had family. He had a community. He went about his days. For 4 to 6 years, nobody connected him to the turquoise van. Investigators moved carefully once they had his name. They could not simply confront him. They needed direct physical confirmation that his DNA matched the evidence from 1973. A surveillance team was deployed in Colorado. Officers followed Neal and waited. When he discarded something that could be tested, the specific circumstances of the covert DNA collection were not released publicly, they recovered it. The DNA from that sample was compared to the DNA from Linda O'Keefe's dress, collected and preserved since the summer of 1973. It matched. On February 19, 2019, 4 to 6 years after Linda O'Keefe walked away from the curb outside Lincoln Intermediate School on a Friday afternoon, James Alan Neal was arrested in Colorado Springs. He was taken into custody without incident. He did not run. He did not resist. He stood there while investigators handcuffed him, and he said nothing of consequence. His family, visibly emotional, was present at his first court appearance. At the news conference in Orange County announcing the arrest, Newport Beach Police Chief John Lewis chose his words with the precision of someone who had been waiting a long time to say them. He said, "From the day Linda was found, the search for Linda and O'Keefe became the search for Linda and O'Keefe's killer. Generations of investigators worked on this case. We never gave up." Orange County District Attorney Todd Spitzer, who had been 12 years old himself when Linda was murdered, stood at that press conference and spoke about what the arrest meant. He said they had never forgotten Linda. He said the case proved that it was now possible to solve cold cases that had seemed permanently closed. He looked at the cameras and said directly what investigators had believed for 4 to 6 years: time is not always the ally of a killer. Neal pleaded not guilty to Linda's murder and to allegations of lewd and lascivious acts on 2 other girls under the age of 14 in Riverside County, offenses linked to him after his identification in Linda's case, stretching from the late 1990s into the early 2000s. More than one generation of children had been in danger from the same man. The connection had never been made while he was free. On May 25, 2020, before the trial could begin, James Alan Neal was taken from the Orange County Jail to a hospital due to an undisclosed illness. He died a few days later. He never stood trial. He never answered, in a courtroom, for what he had done on July 6, 1973. Newport Beach Police Chief Lewis released a statement. He said it had been their intention to see James Alan Neal stand trial and answer for Linda's murder. He said that through the tireless efforts of generations of investigators, they hoped they had brought a measure of closure to Linda's family and loved ones. Linda's older sister Cindy Borgeson gave the most honest account of what the arrest and its aftermath meant to the people who had lived with the absence for 4 to 6 years. She said she had never really believed they would actually find the person responsible. And then they did. And then he died before the trial. And the gap between finding him and having him answer remained, as it does in so many of these cases, unbridgeable. Linda's parents had both died before the arrest was made. They never knew. This case leaves 3 things that belong in any serious conversation about children, safety, and what happens when a community refuses to let a name be forgotten. The first is about one phone call. Cindy O'Keefe was busy on the afternoon of July 6, 1973, and told her 11-year-old daughter to walk home. She has lived with that phone call for more than 50 years. It is important to say clearly and without hesitation that Linda's murder was not Cindy's fault. It was not caused by a mother who was busy on a Friday afternoon. It was caused by a man who had made a decision to hurt a child and who found his opportunity on a summer street. The instinct to look at that phone call and trace the line backward from it is human and understandable, but the line does not actually lead there. It leads to a man in a turquoise van who had been looking for exactly that kind of moment, on exactly that kind of street, on exactly that kind of afternoon. The responsibility begins and ends with him. The second is about the photograph in the detective division. For 4 to 6 years, Linda O'Keefe's photograph was kept in the Newport Beach Police Department's detective division as a permanent reminder that her case was still open. Not filed away. Not archived. On the wall, visible, present, the face of an 11-year-old girl looking at every detective who walked past. The officers who finally arrested James Alan Neal were not the officers who had originally investigated the case, they were not even the generation after that. They were the generation that inherited the photograph and inherited the obligation it represented. The case was solved because enough people, across enough decades, refused to close the file. Persistence, in cold casework, is not a strategy. It is the only strategy. And it works. The third is about what the DNA found on Linda's dress had been carrying for 4 to 6 years. It was collected in 1973, preserved through decades of shifting technology and changing leadership, entered into a federal database that returned nothing for years, submitted to a genealogy website that produced a family match, and finally compared to a covert sample from a man living under a changed name in Colorado. Every step in that chain required a decision by a person who chose to keep going rather than accept that the answer was permanently out of reach. The DNA on that dress was always the truth. It just needed the right combination of technology, persistence, and human refusal to let it stay silent forever. Linda Ann O'Keefe was 11 years old on July 6, 1973. She had called her mother from the school office and been told to walk home. She sat on the curb for a few minutes after that, upset, the way an 11-year-old is upset when a plan falls apart on a summer afternoon. She got up and started walking in the direction of home. She was still wearing the dress her mother had made for her when she was found the next morning. Her killer lived freely for 4 to 6 years. He died before he could be held accountable in a courtroom. But his name is known. And the dress is why. If you have watched this far, leave a comment and tell us where you are watching from. And if you think Linda O'Keefe's story deserves to be remembered, share this video. Because the least we can do, 50 years later, is make sure she is remembered as a person, not just a case. What happened to the people who saw Linda that afternoon stayed with them for the rest of their lives in ways that are worth acknowledging plainly. Jandy, the classmate who saw Linda on the curb outside school and then spotted her again near the van on Marguerite and Inlet Drive, was 11 years old herself. She watched a man in a van stop near her friend more than once. She and her mother drove on. There was nothing in that moment to suggest what it was. There was no sign, no signal, nothing that an 11-year-old girl or her mother could have reasonably been expected to recognize as the edge of a catastrophe. Jandy carried the memory of that afternoon for decades the way witnesses to moments like that always carry them, not as guilt, because guilt requires a mistake, and there was no mistake, but as a kind of permanent weight, the specific heaviness of having been the last person to see someone alive and having had no idea that was what you were doing. The family friend who had also spotted Linda on her walk home and assumed she had already found help carried something similar. He had seen her. He had recognized the situation as ordinary. He had kept driving. By the time the morning came and the news came with it, ordinary had become something else entirely, and there was no way to step back across that line. These are the peripheral wounds of a crime like this. The people who were close enough to the edge of it to feel its heat without being in the center of it. The classmate. The driver. The mother who told her daughter to walk. They are not responsible. But they are not untouched either. And for 4 to 6 years, while James Alan Neal went about his life in Florida and then in Colorado, these people in Orange County carried the specific weight of that afternoon. That weight did not lift when he was identified. It did not lift when he was arrested. Some weights do not lift. They become part of the person who carries them, and that is simply what they are. Terry Briscoe Corwin, who had been one of Linda's close friends and who had been among the children who rode their bikes around the neighborhood in the days after the murder wanting to help find who did it, spoke publicly after Neal's arrest. She said she was grateful that the technology had finally caught up to what had happened. She said she thought about Linda often, the way people think about a friend they lost young, with a grief that does not diminish with time so much as it settles into a place where it can be carried. She said she was glad that Linda's name was still being said out loud. That is perhaps the most ordinary and most important thing about a case that stretched across nearly half a century. That a name is still being said. That an 11-year-old girl who sat on a curb outside her school on a Friday afternoon in the summer of 1973 and was gone before the evening is still, 50 years later, a person whose name people say and whose face people remember and whose story people tell. James Neal spent 4 to 6 years trying to become someone else. He changed his name. He changed his state. He built a different life on top of the one that included what he had done in Corona del Mar. And none of it worked, in the end, because the dress had been in evidence storage the whole time, and the science had kept moving, and the people who were supposed to find the answer had not stopped looking. He thought time was on his side. He was wrong about that. He was wrong about it from the moment Linda's dress went into the evidence bag in July of 1973, and he simply did not know it yet.